Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the show, Science, Facts, and Fallacies podcast. My name is Cameron English, your host as always, joined once again, as always, by Dr. Liza Dunn, emergency medicine physician, toxicologist, GMO ninja, answerer of all the technical questions that are above my pay grade. What's going on, Liza? Good to see you.
Not much. How are you?
I am great. I'm great. We are just in the aftermath of the presidential election. Lights are still on, sun is still out, so the world hasn't ended. However you feel about it, we're still okay.
Tomorrow's another day.
Yes,
this
it is.
Shall pass.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Right? Go take a walk, have some coffee, pet your dog, hug your wife.
There you go.
Oh, you can't see my thumb up. There you go.
I can see.
There you go. Okay. As I mentioned on a recent episode, we're doing something a little bit different because Liza is a world traveler. And so we wanted to take a break from the news cycle, which is insane, as I've alluded to already, and do something that's a little more evergreen, but still very important, and ask Liza about her transition out of medicine and into the corporate world, into the pharmaceutical industry, with an emphasis on what's going wrong in medicine. Because if I'm not mistaken, you were watching some pretty radical changes happen that you were alarmed by, and then you started to see the consequences and you went, I'm out, see ya.
Yep.
So
Yep.
maybe we can start there. On our previous episode, you talked about, how you got into medicine and then how you got into science communication. So with that background already in place, maybe you can talk about when, like, you're in the ER, you're watching things go on that you're worried about, and then how this transition started.
Yeah. So why did I leave medicine for Monsanto? I can tell you that my colleagues in academic medicine were stunned when I did. They were thought, "Oh my goodness, you went to the dark side." And they were. What's fascinating now is that many of them have called me and said, "How do I get out of medicine? How do I get your job? How did you get your job?" There are tons and tons of people who have really come to the conclusion that the trajectory of American medicine has just gone off a cliff. And there's a lot of disillusionment about medicine. So when I started, I absolutely loved my job. I loved taking care of patients. I loved the intellectual rigor of the profession. I loved the different people, the different disciplines that I could talk to. I learned so much from this wonderful academic institution that I was in, and I wound up doing my residency and my fellowship. And really, the academics around it were just second to none. They were just fantastic, and I loved taking care of patients. I really felt like I was making a difference in people's lives. That I was, actually doing something that was very meaningful. Over the years, the bureaucracy began to grow. And with each new kind of bureaucratic, each new sort of regulation that got layered on into medicine, there was more and more and more and more paperwork. And before you knew it, you went from spending lots of time talking to your patients and trying to relate to them to spending all your time with your back to them on a computer, documenting a ridiculous amount of information that was inconsequential for patient management. So when I was an intern and there was a patient coming in the hospital, this is in 2000, 3 pieces of paper would go up with them from the emergency department. It would be the doctor's note, the nurse's note, and then the insurance information. 6 years later, when I came back from my fellowship and started at WashU, I was in the ICU seeing a tox patient, and I was trying to find out kind of what had gone on in the emergency department. And there were 56 pages of documentation of what had gone on in the emergency department, and 95% of it was absolutely irrelevant to what happened in the story. And so you'd have to go through mounds and mounds and mounds of paperwork. So that was one thing. And so when the High Tech Act happened, well, the other thing that happened was communication really got cut off between doctors with the implementation of HIPAA. is the Patient Privacy Act, and that was implemented in late 1990s, early 2000s, and with that, they hired a whole layer of people to do training for patient privacy, and you'd have to do these training sessions where you tried to figure out who was asking about patient information. Now, it's one thing when you've got a celebrity or something like that, and everybody wants to know, but most people don't really care what's going on with your Uncle Joe, right? And so they aren't interested in that information. They're not trying to figure it out. Usually, when somebody is trying to communicate about patient care, it's a doctor thing or a nurse doctor thing. So, as a toxicologist, as one of maybe 1,200 in the world, there are not toxicologists in every single hospital. And so you would get on the phone because you've been asked to consult remotely on a patient and give advice on how to take care of that patient. And you would get a secretary who would block you from talking to other physicians or other nurses or healthcare providers about a patient's care because of HIPAA and trying to protect the patient when you were actually trying to help the patient. And they would it made it much more difficult to communicate, important healthcare information. Incidentally, there was I got a phone call. A politician who shall remain unnamed wound up during one of the big campaigns in the ER. And I got a phone call to my cell phone from a reporter who said that my former boss had given them my number so they could find out what this politician was doing in the ER. And I'm like, if you think I'm going to try to give you any of that information for 15 minutes of fame, you are out of your mind. Click. So most doctors are going to be able to suss out who is, calling for what and whether or not it's important. So the communication started falling off because of the amount of documentation that you had to do. So, for example, nurses would put in vital signs every hour and a full exam every hour, not just check them, right? It would have to write it all out, right? And so they were so busy typing normal exam after normal exam after normal exam after normal exam every hour in the electronic medical record that they weren't able to be administering drugs that you were asking them to give to the patients or helping you sedate patients who are undergoing, painful procedures. They were so busy typing a normal exam after a normal exam after a normal exam. So a lot of useless documentation was going on. So that turned into a time sink that took away from patient care. That was problematic. Enter the HITECH Act when every doctor had to, in independent practice, had to buy an electronic medical record and document everything electronically. That was a huge expense for physicians. These programs were not tailored to individual physicians' work. They didn't go with their workflow. They had to keep on updating them. They had to buy all sorts of packages for security to maintain patient privacy, preventing.
Just real quick,
hacked. Yeah.
If you know cost wise, what kind of an investment is that to buy?
I think the doctor that I talked to, who had a private practice and was in private practice for decades, his electronic healthcare system was $55,000 out of the box, adjusted for his particular practice. So then he had to, buy all these bells and whistles. And then he had to keep security things up on it. And when I was talking to him, he had been in private practice for a very, very long time and actually wound up bringing home, netting that year, $48,000. That was his income after everything. So the electronic medical record wound up being a big, huge cost sink for physicians in private practice. The other thing that happened in private practice was that insurance companies realized that they held the strings to the payments. And so you went from being a doctor and saying, I think this patient needs this procedure to treat this problem. And this happened when this started happening when my dad was practicing. to having to have call an insurance company to get permission to do a procedure that you knew that the patient needed. And if you didn't call them to get permission and did the procedure, you wouldn't get paid. So these are pre-authorizations, and the pre-authorizations just started causing more and more and more administrative red tape. So you now went from a private practice where you had one or two people working for you to somebody then you had to hire to get pre-authorizations done, and they'd be on the phone for hours trying to get permission to do a procedure, right? And then you also, if you didn't code or bill the right way, you wouldn't get paid either. So you'd have to document in certain ways, or you wouldn't get paid. So private practices realized that the overhead for their back offices and their malpractice insurance was also something that was crazy. If you're an OBGYN, you can double check this, but if you're an OBGYN, you would have to make sure that you had paid for a tail plan, which was you were liable for the last baby you delivered for 21 years. So if you retired at 60, you were on the hook until you were 81. So this got to be cost prohibitive. All of these things got to be cost prohibitive for physicians, and also we're taking physicians away from doing what they were good at. They wanted to take care of patients. They didn't want to have everybody, Monday morning quarterbacking them and things like that. So they then realized that it's easier to become a hospital employee and have the hospital take care of your malpractice, of your electronic medical records, of all of this kind of stuff, and you just want to do your job. Well, then hospitals started consolidating a whole bunch of things, and they realized that this was a real gravy train, right? So they decided, that you needed to be meticulous in your documentation. So you would get notes a month after you'd seen a patient about, can you tell me if you put this IV in? And you had to address this because they could bill more for a doctor putting an IV in than a nurse. And so you would have to try to remember if you put the IV in from a month before, and your quote unquote bonus was riding on how well you documented each and every little tiny procedure you did. And I started thinking of this as, that's really not okay. They're starting to try to milk money out of this. And so then they did the Affordable Care Act, right? And the Affordable Care Act on the surface sounded like it was, a wonderful thing, but it actually really wasn't. And it really, all of the power then went to insurance companies. The littler insurance companies couldn't keep up. They thought it was going to be a good business opportunity. They couldn't keep up. So the big insurance companies wound up getting all of the money for the Affordable Care Act. And then they got in cahoots with the hospitals, and they are now just a huge, huge leviathan. It's just incredible, right? And so hospitals started consolidating and cutting deals with insurance companies, cutting deals with PBMs, and it really became a big, big business, and it was off the back of doctors. And what turned me completely around, because I'd always heard about big pharma this, big pharma that, big pharma this, and as academics we should be keeping our hands clean from industry. And even though this was a huge industry and it was responsible for the bankruptcy of, the leading cause of bankruptcy in the United States is medical bills. And the last time I checked, 76, and this was prior to the Affordable Care Act even, 76% of the people going bankrupt had insurance. So obviously the insurance was not protecting them. Secondly, just because you had insurance didn't mean you had access to doctors. You couldn't get to doctors because the insurance company would decide which doctor you could go to. If you were an ER doctor or an anesthesiologist, you were often out of their what was it called? Out of their network is what they would call it. And so they would bill more, or you would be on the hook for paying the ER doctor who wasn't getting the money. It was going to the hospital, or the anesthesiologist who wasn't going, or the radiologist, because they were quote unquote out of network for your insurance company. And so I thought, this is terrible. You know, how can we sit there and say, you know, how can we say big pharma is bad when, you know, hospitals are tacking on 10,000, 100,000% on the drugs that they're administering, right? A 250 cc bag of normal saline costs $250. That's nuts, right? So I started getting disillusioned with that kind of thing. And then there was a story that just did me in. And the story that just did me in was I had a patient come in who had been bitten by a dog. And he just basically had a scratch on the back of his leg. But they couldn't find the dog. And it was a junkyard dog. And the patient was essentially a street cleaner. And so the median income at the time in the United States was about $50,000. And so he was probably making less than that a year, right? And so he came in, and because we couldn't find the dog, he needed the rabies vaccine and rabies series, right? And so what that is, so he got a tetanus shot, he got a rabies vaccine, and then you also, the first day, you do rabies immunoglobulin, which is like giving them antibodies to bind up any kind of rabies that to prevent it from spreading, right? And so that's a huge dose, right? So I gave him those, and then he had to come back on so that was day 0, day 3, day 7, and day 14 for repeat vaccines. And I met him in the waiting room so he wouldn't have to have a prolonged wait to see, to get him this series. 2 weeks after he was finished with the whole thing, he shows up in the ER again looking for me with his hospital bill. And his hospital bill was $16,000. $4,000 of which was a trauma leveling fee because he was billed as a quote unquote trauma because he got bitten by a dog. And so he was a level 3 trauma. If you stub your toe, you're a level 3 trauma. And I was like, there's no trauma surgeon saw this guy. And why is the trauma service getting $4,000 of his bill? That to me doesn't sound right. And I called billing and I said, I want to know how much a level 1 is. I want to know which is the most severe trauma. Okay. I want to know how much a level 2 is. And I want to know how much a level 3 is. Because he got charged $4,000 on that first day. And for every visit he came back, there was a couple $100 in trauma fees for the next 3 things, even though he'd never seen a trauma surgeon. And they refused to tell me how much any of that was. And I was like, I think I am looking at my electronic medical record here, and I am seeing patients on this tracking board. I am seeing multiple level 1s, multiple level 2s, and multiple level 3s. And we had been told repeatedly by the trauma service that we were not allowed to downgrade traumas, even if we were at the bedside and we thought that the patient had been misleveled. So, for example, if you got shot anywhere near the head, right, that was a level 1 trauma. That seems to make sense, except for if you were shot in the hair, right? You don't need the trauma service if you got shot in the hair. And I had a patient that got shot in the hair that got billed as a level 1. He came walking in. He did not need a doctor. That got billed as a level 1. And I was like, because of that, and I said, trauma, you guys get out of here. I don't need you here. Go away. And they're like, you're not allowed to downgrade it. And I didn't know why they were so adamant about this, right? And it turned out that they were adamant about it because they didn't want to tell us how much money they were making off of this.
Right. So everyone's got money to make. That's why.
That's exactly right.
It's so fascinating. Sorry, keep going. I didn't mean to.
Oh yeah. So anyway, they eventually the billing people wouldn't tell me. We eventually had a faculty meeting where I said, "This seems to me to be fraudulent," and they were like, "Don't say the F word." And I was like, "How can you justify this?" And then I had an excess. So it turned out that level 1 was $10,000. A level 2 was $7,000, and a level 3 was $4 or $5,000. And I'm sure this is back in 2014, so 10 years ago. I'm sure the price has gone up. I had an existential crisis right then and there about what I was doing and what I was participating in. And I started thinking, I didn't go into this to bankrupt people. I cannot ethically continue down this path. I really had an existential crisis, and I've told this story publicly maybe once or twice, but I've never told it in full. So it was the bureaucratic burden that built up where I was sitting there, having to document so much stuff that it was taking away from patient care, and that documentation was directly tied to making the hospital more money. It was the inability to do pro bono work. I mean, I had volunteered to go down to Haiti, right? And I wasn't able to. Anytime I wanted to continue like international work or humanitarian work, that was really not supported by the institution. And that's what got me into medicine in the first place. And then I just felt like I was having less and less of an impact and got very burnt out on it. And I think that this is the position that many physicians are finding themselves in today. And that's why there is such a burnout crisis. Not to mention the fact, though, that I was very fortunate in that I paid off my student loans. Many people, I know somebody who graduated at 40 with $450,000 worth of debt. And so the medical schools are really burdening physicians with a huge debt load. And so many physicians feel like they cannot get out of the hospital. They cannot leave medicine. They're literally trapped because of their loans. And so they don't want to make waves about different issues, which we can maybe get into in a little bit, but they don't want to make waves because they are literally being held hostage by their student debt. But I was fortunate enough to have paid off my student loans, and so I was able to look elsewhere. And so I didn't look for Monsanto, but somebody I knew at Monsanto had seen my career trajectory, had watched me build the tox program and all of this stuff, and sent an email to our toxicology group in December of 2015, asking if anyone wanted to be trained into his job because he was going to be retiring. And there was a 2-year kind of training period, and then he would retire. And I thought, I don't want to go work for Monsanto. That's a bad company. I've heard so many bad things about it. And so I just left the email. I just really literally ignored it. And then a friend of mine, and we said this in the last episode, but a friend of mine who has a son in my son's class, who was a lawyer for Monsanto, said, you should go look at this job. And this was in February of 2016. And so I interviewed on St. Patrick's Day, and I call it the luckiest day of my life because they gave me, I was blown away by the caliber of the people that interviewed me. And I felt like that this was really a global job, that I was able to make an impact on the people that I wanted to make an impact on. I wanted to be able to help people in developing countries get the best nutrition and the best healthcare that they possibly could. And so I became the medical affairs lead for the crop science division, and I haven't looked back. And a bunch of doctors have called me. They were first scandalized, and now they are all calling me saying, how did you get your job?
So there's so many important lessons that come out of what you just said. First, I'm utterly horrified to see how patients are being taken advantage of, how people are being bankrupted, and, for things that they can't control, right? If you get bitten by a dog, it's not, right? You didn't chain smoke for 40 years.
No.
Right? That's unbelievable. And then to see the way that physicians are being taken advantage of, in many cases losing their practices, losing their livelihoods. But then seeing the consolidation of the system, people not realizing that because a law is called the High Tech Act or the Affordable Care Act, It doesn't actually do those things necessarily. And there may be some interests that are pushing that, right? What a coincidence that you have to buy this super costly software suite.
Yes.
And it leads to the consolidation. It leads to bigger customers
Yep.
for the software company, right? How interesting that all this works together. That's one thing that sticks out to me. The other thing, though, and this goes to, I guess, to patient care, is that the bigger and more bureaucratized the system becomes, the worse the care gets, right? The worse
Yep.
the service, because the bureaucracy wants to sustain itself and grow and consume more resources. And I think I owe this analogy to Orrin McIntyre, who's a political commentator, wrote a book called The Total State. And one of the things he has explained is that as the bigger these systems get, the product that they offer just becomes cafeteria food.
That's right.
Everybody more or less gets the same serving of mashed potatoes, peas, mystery meat, and a fruit cup for dessert.
That's right.
Because the system is so big, you have to, what's the word I'm looking for? You have to deliver the same uniform product. That's the only way you can systematize something at that scale. And in this case, the cafeteria food is subpar healthcare for
That's right.
cancer or some major surgery or something. So, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. Well, once again, I think people romanticize what socialized medicine is. They think, oh, single payer system, this is going to be wonderful. Well, if you like the COVID response, that's going to be kind of how the single payer system is going to work for your healthcare. It's going to be whatever is the cheapest, whatever is the it's not personalized, directed at you anymore. It's really, with every government intervention into medicine, you lost the patient-doctor relationship, and you wind up having more and more bureaucracy around it. And so you're paying for that bureaucracy. That's what your dollars are going to, right? And that bureaucracy is built on this kind of crazy language, right? I watched the language of safety, get co-opted to be put in an agenda. Because if you disagreed with the electronic medical record, well, you're clearly not interested in patient safety, because the electronic medical record will flag it when there's an allergy, or you won't get your handwriting. Doctors are notoriously terrible writers, right? And you can't read their handwriting, and that was one of the big sales pitches for the electronic medical record. And then the overreach has gotten to be incredible into the patient-doctor relationship. If you have a pain patient that you want to give an opioid to because they have real pain, you're tracked, you're monitored, and you are being, if you veer from some bureaucrat who's not at the bedside looking at the patient, if you veer from what they deem to be good practice, your license is on the line. And so there's all of that. And then there was also all of these kind of merit badge training things that you would have to do. So you would have to do ATLS every 4 years, advanced trauma life support. And that is a training that takes 2 days of your time and costs $500 out of your pocket in order to maintain your certification for the emergency department. When you're doing traumas all day long, every day, right? It's part of your everyday practice, and you still have to do this. Same thing with ACLS, advanced cardiac life support. You'd have a nurse who couldn't tell you what these different arrhythmias were on an EKG. And you were supposed to be taking this course that took, once again, 2 days and cost a couple $100. This was every 2 years. And then if you were in pediatric emergency medicine, you'd have to take PALS. If you wanted to do hazmat, you'd have to get training for hazmat. And this was repeated over and over and over again. You'd have to get all these different merit badges. It used to be, when you took your board certification exam, that it was a one-off and you were board certified for life, until they realized they could make a whole lot of money off of a captive group, right? And so you would have to take an exam that was an open book exam that you could take with other doctors for 8 of 10 years. That cost $150, $200 to take. You could pay for CME to do it. And if you didn't do that exam, that set of exams over that time frame, you weren't eligible to retake your boards again, which is another $2,500, $3,000, right? Every 10 years. So there's a gravy train of bureaucrats that are just sitting there capitalizing on this captive audience that's stuck. And it's completely unethical, and it completely takes away from patient care. And yes, doctors are highly paid, but if you're graduating with $450,000 worth of debt when you're 40, there's no way you're going to ever be able to retire. So it's turned into a racket, and lots of people are very upset about it. Now, lots of people also say, and maybe we can touch on this a little bit, but why did doctors behave the way, why, especially in academic medicine, why did doctors behave the way they did during COVID? And I want to hear your thoughts about what you think that was.
You mean like in an ER situation?
In an ER situation, or like doctors got on board with a lot of kind of things that I don't necessarily think that they all believed in.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. I think, uh, knowing you and listening to you talk about this over the last couple of years and some reading that I've done, I think that if you are in medicine, as um, as bureaucratized as it's become, as thoroughly connected to the federal government as it is, you are playing with fire. If the FDA or the CDC or Health and Human Services or the figurehead for the federal response to COVID, if they come out and they say this is how you do this, and you're a hospital system or you're a healthcare provider, and you go, no, I don't think so. Here's why. Here's the science. You're likely risking a lot of
Your
federal
job.
funding. Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
And if you're an administrator and you're running a system, you're going to tell all of your doctors, this is
This
the
is how
way,
it's going to be.
right?
Yeah.
This is how we serve the mashed potatoes and mystery meat because
That's
thus,
exactly
thus say
that's
it,
exactly what happened.
thus
That's
saith
exactly
the
what
Lord.
happened.
Yeah.
Doctors doctors who had a different opinion about things were not only completely alienated, so some lost jobs and things like that. I think that the art part of the art of medicine is learning how to understand a disease process, and those you may have a different practice than somebody else, and that's the way it always has been. But that individualism has been completely lost. And now, if you don't conform to exactly the prescribed plan, that you really face some serious consequences. And we saw that with COVID, but we also have seen that with the gender transition stuff. Physicians who disagreed with that were absolutely sidelined, and I think that thing, with the there are two big things that I think medicine demonstrated that it clearly lost its way, and I think that there was a tweet I saw the other day that only 31% of the population trusts the medical system. How did we get to that? I mean, we had a stellar, top, world-class medical system. It was expensive, but you could get into doctors and see them. But how did we get to this? Two events. The COVID response, when doctors said that it was okay for the public to be out during a riot, and we're not letting people to the bedside of their sick relatives because of this pandemic. The public went, whoa, wait a minute. I've lost my business. I've lost my livelihood because of this shutdown. And you're saying it's okay to riot? That was step one. And then the step two thing is, we can't trust us on this vaccine, but we can't tell the difference between boys and girls. Those two things cost everything for medicine. And if you disagreed with that in any capacity, your job was on the line. And so I think that is why we find ourselves in the situation that we're in. Doctors are not empowered. Doctors are, it's a huge megalith of a system, and it's really been bad for medicine.
It's wild. And I think what you're illustrating is that the narrative that everyone was sold about COVID and about other things as well is that there's this consensus of these truth-seeking experts, and all they do is they get together in groups at symposia and they go over the facts and they all decide what the truth is. And if you disagree with the truth, well, you're a quack doctor or you're a hillbilly and you're just too stupid to understand science. That, in essence, is what everyone was told.
That's right.
These are the facts. You follow the facts. What? Do you hate the science? Do you hate medicine? And in reality, what you're saying is there are some very practical incentives in place to, let's say, encourage people to say the right things.
That's right.
And that's important, right? And I think even the people that criticize the COVID response overlooked this, or they generalized it and they just said, oh, big pharma owns the system or whatever.
That's right.
And in reality, it's not that pharma owns everything. It's not that there's an anti-science mentality within medicine. It's that people are safeguarding their livelihoods. And so it's easier, and not to justify it in any way, because what do we say on the show? Lots of wrong think. There's lots of wrong think on this show, which I'm happy to own. Nevertheless, do you just keep your mouth shut about, encouraging people to burn down buildings in the middle of a pandemic? Or do you take a stand and risk your paycheck for something that might not change anything? I mean, that's a real calculus that a lot of people had to run.
That's exactly right. And I do think that there are a lot of ideologic medical students and young doctors that kind of really believe in, lockdowns and things like that. But once again, their paycheck wasn't on the line. They weren't losing their business. They had a job, and they needed that job desperately because they had a huge pile of debt, right? But the recommendations that were being made caused lots and lots of ordinary people to lose their jobs. And what these younger doctors didn't realize was how much animus that created towards them. They held the doctors responsible for this when it really wasn't. The doctors were just keeping their heads down and working and trying to get through this horrible, truly deadly pandemic. So the public doesn't understand kind of the background that the doctors were coming from. But I think that you can't do the ideology thing. You got to do what is real, what's on the ground, and explaining away inconsistencies by using your ideology. All that does is alienate people, and it demonstrates that you are not able to put yourself in other people's shoes.
Yeah, what I've seen in the wake of it, you're a very refreshing exception to this, but what I've seen in the wake of the pandemic is a lot of people not learning very much about this. Maybe because the incentives are still the same, but on one of our spaces, we brought up this whole, because this is what shook me out of it, because at the beginning of the pandemic, I was Mr. Pro Science and I knew all these academics and they were telling me this, and, these people, I can trust them because they usually are right. And then I saw, the news starting to say, well, look, if you want to gather by the tens of thousands in a major city, don't let this deadly infectious disease stop you, but you can't go to church. And that impacted me directly, right? Because I have young kids, and right down the street, there's people lighting buildings on fire, but I can't go to church because, I might cough on an old lady. It was infuriating. But anyways, not to get off on that track. In one of our spaces, we had an academic scientist say, the people, because there were public health officials and experts signing open letters declaring their support for these riots. And what this person tried to say was, well, that was lab technicians and that was nurses, right? These were low-level people in medicine who were approving of this. And for a few reasons, that really irritated me. For one thing, where were all you guys? Whose labs are they working in? Whose hospitals are they working in? You're the senior person here and you had no oversight of what these people were saying publicly. I know that's not exactly true. Right. But the other thing is, it's like, that was not true. I saw lots of people, lots of MDs, lots of PhDs with lots of experience cheerleading this.
That's exactly
and
right.
telling me it was good. It's good that these cities are being burned in the middle of a pandemic. I'm like, how can that be good for public health?
Exactly.
How?
And then the ultimate icing on the cake this year is when that physician, I can't remember his name, Varma? comes out,
Jay
this
Varma.
COVID czar for New York City that kept everybody locked down. And I will contend, New York. I know the physicians at Elmhurst Hospital who were at ground zero with lots and lots of sick, dead people. I know them. I know they were doing their best to take care of them. But this guy turns out to be doing ecstasy and having sex parties in the middle of the pandemic with his pediatrician wife. And it's mind blowing. It's infuriating that it betrays every single fundamental basic concept in medicine: first do no harm. And you have harmed, you not only did you put people at risk for a whole bunch of things, including monkeypox and all of the other stuff that was going around, but not only did you put a whole bunch of people at risk, but you also harmed the house of medicine. You completely trashed the reputation of this incredibly important profession.
And nothing has happened, by the way, which you said, right? You said
Yeah,
there'd be no repercussions for this.
nothing.
There was a news cycle, the Times, New York Times,
He got let go from some kind of job, but
right, but the news covered it, but there was no outrage. Nobody in science, to my knowledge, except for us on our spaces and on this podcast, no one has said anything because this guy's on Team Science, and you don't criticize your own. Yeah, no one. Right, everyone's got an opinion, for better or worse, about Ron DeSantis and Latipo, his Surgeon General, and
so I disagree with his Surgeon General.
yeah, odd duck for sure. There's some weird ideas, no denying that. But everyone's got an opinion on them. Everyone's got an opinion on every person who wanted to go to work and didn't understand why they were locked down. But this guy doing illegal drugs and having group sex in the middle of a pandemic, we have nothing to say about this guy. You know?
It's incredible.
So, yeah.
It's incredible, especially since we throw aspersions against all sorts of other people. We've got this whole, it's almost like the Pharisees. We've got this holier than thou attitude towards everybody else. And it's time to maybe reflect a little bit on kind of what's transpired and why there's a 31%. We're below Congress, a 31% approval for the House of Medicine. Doctors need to get it back.
Yeah, as we wrap up here, there's a really good point in here. All the stuff you're talking about. People will talk about an issue like vaccine hesitancy. And there's this very popular point that a lot of people will make, and they'll say, when the polio vaccine came out, there was none of this politicization, and there was none of this outrage, and there was none of this partisanship. People just rolled up their sleeves and got the shot because that's what you did for your community, and that's what you did for your country. True. But look how much our country has changed. Look at the ideologically, demographically, just in terms of population size, it's a different place. And so we do this analysis in a vacuum. We're like, well, in 1955, everyone just did what we told them to do. And in 2024, everybody hates us. Mm-hmm. It's like, okay, well, now let's backtrack. What has happened over the years that might lead the average person who doesn't know that much about science or medicine and has no real reason to dislike you or to love you one way or the other? What would push them over the edge to the point where they won't believe anything you say? Oh, I don't know. Nothing. They're just crazy. Right. It's like, no, you guys are, anyways.
It's a time for a little self-reflection.
Yes. Yeah. Let's, go buy a self-help book. Go do a Tony Robbins seminar. I don't know. What is it? 7 rules for highly effective people or whatever.
There you go. Yeah. Or how to win friends and influence people.
There you go.
Right?
Yeah. Do some affirmations.
Yep.
Yeah. I don't know. Anyways, I really appreciate you sharing that. This, again, is the kind of stuff that people need to know that is just not discussed. I mean, I'm sure physicians talk about this amongst themselves, but there is no, and on Twitter, maybe some, but there's no Here's the CBS News story about why medicine is melting down in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
No one's going to talk about that. So
That's right.
very good. Well, if you want to learn more about this, Liza loves talking about this stuff, by the way. If you ask her on Twitter, she will just she'll go off. She'll go off, which is how like this podcast ended up the way it is. So you can follow both of us on X. It's at Dr. Liza MD. I'm at Cam J English. Our spaces are every Friday at 11 a.m. Central. And we basically do this. We bring up a topic and Liza says, here's what we're talking about. And then we all just interact. In fact,
it's great.
We brought up the group sex having doctor. And the only response and there were a lot of academics, the only response was from one guy who started going on about racism in the Republican Party. I'm like, all right, I'm glad we're doing this. Here we go. I'm like, yep, that has absolutely nothing to do with what I said. Anyways, follow us. If nothing else, it's exciting, and you'll learn a little bit.
And bring your ideas. We like to discuss ideas.
Open dialogue is very good. We enjoy it. We are fans of it. Thank you as always. Liza's traveling. We'll be back to our regular format, hopefully on the next episode. But until then, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Take care.